The time is exactly 9:27. This is News and Views on Salam Media, and next we're going to be talking with political analyst Levy Ndou, and we're going to be looking at 28 years later. Has the ANC delivered? When we look at the issue of governance, can we safely say that we've been governed competently? Where are we now, 28 years later? Are we perhaps on the brink of collapse? I certainly hope not. Levy Ndou, a very good morning to you. Welcome to the program. And all I can say to you as I start this interview is that I am very worried with the state of the situation in South Africa. Welcome, your thoughts.
Good morning, Julie. Good morning to the listeners at home. We should be worried based on the fact that when we started in 94, we started on a very, very high note, and there were a lot of expectations on the part of the people on the ground, and equally so, we appeared to have assembled a very, very good team to be able to take us forward. What we then did in 1994, we had a leader who was acceptable to all South Africans. We had a leader who was preaching reconciliation and who wanted to bring all South Africans together. That was a very, very big project that former Nelson Mandela, the former president of South Africa, had to initiate. What we also then did, Julie, was to develop programs through the RDP that had to bring the past and the present in some form of an alignment to say those who were the victims of apartheid should actually be taken from one level to the other. But what we also did, also very importantly, is that we had a constitution that started to give our citizens rights which they did not have in the past. That is where we started on a very, very high note. Everybody was excited that there are programs that have to address the imbalances of the past. Everybody was excited that we now have rights, we can vote, we have regular elections, and all those other things. What then followed are the challenges of gradual incompetency and gradual ignorance of what is supposed to be done for the people of South Africa. That is why you should be worried, Julie, that we have got state capture. You should be worried that corruption is very rife in South Africa. We should be worried that all entities are collapsing. We should be worried that there is a clear element of lawlessness. So those are the issues that we actually have to be very much worried about. And if we don't pick up the pieces and do something better about it, we might be heading for a much bigger disaster.
So, Levy, my first interview on the show this morning was with a journalist based in Sri Lanka. And undoubtedly, as a political analyst, you have been following the Sri Lankan story as well. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in protest in Sri Lanka against corrupt politicians. But for me, what stood out, and in my interview with that journalist, is the issue around, despite the massive crowds that took to the streets, there was only one fatality and approximately 50 people that were slightly injured. This due to the heavy handedness of the army and the police in that country. Thus far, everything is very civil. They have asked for the corrupt politicians to hand in their resignations and for the country to get back onto their feet and be governed by people that can be trusted. Uh, do you think that that sort of a scenario can play out here? Because as I speak about this scenario in Sri Lanka, what also comes to mind is the unrest, the riots, the insurrection, call it what you will, in July last year in KZN. And I kind of wonder about our political will. I kind of wonder about our psyche, the young people's psyche in South Africa. Do they not think that if they cause this type of unrest and total damage to the infrastructure, that sadly the poorest of the poor will continue to suffer?
Well, I think our situation is quite different. And I will tell you why we say our situation is different.
Okay.
We have allowed, in South Africa, we have allowed lawlessness to prevail. And that is why, even though you talk of a riot or a strike or a protest in South Africa, it is always associated with violence and the destruction to property. And the question that you and I would ask is that, has anything ever happened to people who are involved in the destruction of property in South Africa? Nothing does happen. I'm happy that in Sri Lanka, they would all actually talk about the presence of the police who will do something. The
Ah.
unfortunate situation is that in South Africa, you'll have the presence of police who will do nothing. You and I were watching the July unrest last year, and we could see police standing and folding their arms, doing nothing. So that is the difference that we have. Another issue about South Africa is that even though we are concerned about corruption, the unfortunate part is that not all of us are singing from the same book.
Mm.
We have got people in South Africa who are eagerly waiting to defend corrupt leaders.
Mm.
We have got people who would be prepared, and they will voice it openly and say, we are prepared to defend a corrupt, accused individual. So
Mhm.
that is the situation that we face in South Africa. Our fight against corruption, if we're not doing it united as a nation, there are certain segments of the South African society that are very much comfortable with corruption and corrupt leaders, and we have got a section that is not comfortable with that. So we have got a journey that we need to take in South Africa, in my view. And that journey will require all of us to be participants in good faith in order to be able to fight against corruption. As long as we are selective when we are dealing with corruption, and we isolate others as corrupt, and others point at others as not corrupt, knowing that they've done wrong things or corrupt activities, we will not be going anywhere as South Africa. Another aspect that I think South Africa has to deal with, which is a very, very serious one, is the level of consequence management in South Africa. As much as we continue to complain about corruption and corrupt activities, how many people have been arrested and been brought to book by our law enforcement agencies in South Africa? And the number is very, very little. So it is the problem is much bigger than we think. If we can do what other countries will do in order to deal with corruption and corrupt elements, we can be able to achieve that, provided we are all united.
And that's a very big ask, is it not? How do we get to that point is the big question. Because I kind of wonder, we're also hearing murmurings of a possible, we've been told that South Africa is ripe for another insurrection. Your thought, and how do we prevent it?
Well, there are things that um, are obvious. The obvious reality in South Africa today is that the there is a general collapse of trust on politicians. Number two, there are other factors that are influencing the the poor state of the economy that we are facing in South Africa. The high food prices, the high fuel prices, unemployment, and lawlessness in South Africa. Those are those are the elements for me that would create a fertile ground for unrest to take place in South Africa. Preventing that, it will require very strong political leadership and very strong law enforcement agencies that must be on the ground, that must be able to prevent such from happening. But as long as we see corrupt politicians living in luxury, South Africans might be tempted to decide and do things that might not be acceptable.
So, Levi, let me put the next question to you. It might be very, very simplistic, but let's look at it anyway. The issue around the high food and fuel prices. Politicians might argue that the fuel price rise is beyond their control because of Russia's war on the Ukraine, and the whole world is being held against their will regarding this issue, the oil price. The same can be argued with food because the grain out of Ukraine is unable to move. Russia won't allow the grain to be, to reach its designated markets, Africa included. So that's what the politicians will argue. But is there a way that the politicians can stop lining their pockets and let food and fuel prices be stabilized in some way so that things can be more affordable for the poorest of the poor and we don't reach a point of a South African spring? Because that's one of my big fears.
The big fears that we have, as you clearly articulated, are informed by external forces, which might be beyond our control. But
Mm-hmm.
maybe, Julie, in the interest of time, I must also pose this question to the listeners now. That says that why is it difficult for us as South Africans to be able to produce our own food? We can produce our own food. We can be able to have our own food that can make us sustainable. The unfortunate part is that in some instances we appear to be focusing on other areas rather than producing food for ourselves. If we are able and if we can start projects that are supposed to make our rural areas sustainable and produce food, wouldn't be stranded as we are today. You need creative citizens. You need government to encourage people to be able to make food for themselves so that some of the challenges we should be able to address them by ourselves and not rely on people from outside. We are not the producers of oil. One can understand why we've got a challenge of oil. But when it comes to food, with an abundance of land and labor in South Africa, we should be able to plan now that in the future we shouldn't be frustrated by being supplied with food from other countries because we have got the potential to create food for ourselves.
My final question to you is the other thing that worries me is the whole debacle around ESCOM. There are suggestions that there's a lot of sabotage going on there, and our political leaders do not come forward when we have this is a crisis. The power outages, as far as I'm concerned, is a total crisis, and if it is not contained, we are really, in fact, I think we're in deep trouble already. um, where and how do we move forward with the issue around with Eskom? A while ago, I spoke to an economist and I asked the question: is deregulation of gas and fuel not perhaps the answer? He didn't agree with me, but it seems as if that's the route we might have to go.
Gordon says that there could be a possibility of the second state capture inquiry, because he talks about people that are found in the SOEs, who are there to milk the SOEs and also sabotaging the SOEs not to function properly.
Levi,
They
Levi, let me come in here. Let me interrupt you. I don't even think it's necessary for a second state capture report. It's already cost us as South Africans over R1 billion, and nobody has been brought to account with the publishing of the first state capture findings. Why should we go down that route? The country is broken. It needs to be fixed. It doesn't need more state capture reports. Your thoughts?
I was I was coming right there to say they
Okay.
know where the problem lies. So what they
Absolutely.
must do is to fix the problem. I
Right.
I'm not impressed by the statements that says that there is sabotage at ESCOM. If you know that there is sabotage, then you need to plan against sabotagers so that we have electricity. ESCOM has got a very simple mandate to make sure that we have electricity. And when we don't have electricity, we don't expect to hear excuses. We want to hear those are given responsibility to provide light to do so. And unfortunately, that is not happening.
So, as you and I talk this morning, Levi, we don't have we don't have a functioning government. We don't understand what governance is all about. And it seems as we're paralyzed. We just can't bring them to account. What needs to happen now? Who is going to hold these people to account?
We are in a very difficult situation in the sense that the same institutions that we have created are
Mm,
actually not working in our favor. I don't expect to hear. Maybe we need to start looking at this one. We have got a tendency of having ministers complaining rather than providing solutions. I expect ministers to have understood the challenges in their different departments. What they must do is to provide solutions, and that is not what we're getting. Now, it talks to the collapse of governance, and it will require those that are given these responsibilities to change their ways, or civil society might be tempted to take over.
absolutely. So we'll watch this space very carefully. Also, these conferences, the ANC conferences that are happening, the December elective conference, and of course, also it's going to be interesting to see how the 2024 elections roll out. But always a pleasure talking to you, Levi. We're going to have to pick up on this discussion another time. You go well, and thank you for your time.
You always welcome, Julie. Thank you so much.
That was Levy Ndou, political analyst, talking about, gosh, governance in South Africa. There is no governance, there is no accountability. And as far as I'm concerned, our political leaders have hopelessly failed all of us. Hard-working taxpayers, you and I, have been failed and have been let down. 9:47 exactly. News and views on Salam Media. In a minute or two, we'll be joined by Jack Bloom, the DA's Gauteng Shadow Health MEC, about the second fire at Charlotte Maxeke Hospital. Do stay with us.
Don't be